I played a lot of games, and with that comes the attention to detail to notice everything that stands out during the time we play these games. One thing that tends to vary between titles across the board on different systems is their ability to maintain a near equivalent balance of art, story, game flow, controls, and most importantly, music. Imagine your favorite game, now strip it of the soundtrack. Would it still be your favorite game? To me, music is the glue that validates the experience that we have, and while I've done an episode talking about my top 10 NES soundtracks, I always wanted the potential to talk about more of the music on this classic system. So today I'm going to tell you about 10 more amazing soundtracks on the NES. Granted, some of these are relatively well known, and that's one thing I avoided in the first video, so you might see some games that you know, and I just wanted to put that out there. Don't be mad at me, I'm just a boy. I will say one of my biggest pet peeves is when channels make a video talking about how epic the music is and then proceed to talk over the music. So I'll give you a little blurb about the game, then I'll shut up, because you're here for the tunes, not for me. Let's begin. Do you like adventure games? Do you like action games? Do you like shoot 'em ups? How about if we combine them? Sure, I hope it pans out. And for Compile, it did. Compile is one of those companies that found their niche and proceeded to pound out shooters like it was nobody's business. And many times these games aligned with a franchise known as Aleste. While Aleste alone had 10 unique entries, the Spriggan series and other spin-offs are related to it, such as Blazing Lasers, Gunnak, Xanac, Sorcerer Striker, or Sylphia. You'll see small references to the story that justify the thought process that they do belong to the Umbrella universe. Now, the music was composed by Masanori Miyamoto. He worked with Compile from 1985 and left around 1990, and the Guardian Legends soundtrack is considered one of his best works. Let's listen to a few tracks. Oftentimes considered the black sheep of the original trilogy, this game is special to me. I've mentioned before that I was a huge fan of the angry video game nerd. Most of us were and continue to be. He brought games to our attention and did so with a humor that fit the bill for what we liked. But I always had this nagging feeling that sometimes he was being unnecessarily mean to the games for comedic effect. And that was none the more obvious than with Castlevania II. Now, I'm not saying there weren't some really subpar design choices, and I'm definitely not saying it was translated correctly nor effectively for American audiences, but on face value, the game is fun, and I do suggest people check it out. Here's some of my favorite songs from it. In my previous episode, I avoided mentioning games that had only a few soundtracks, and because of that, we had an inherent lack of some of the most popular games on the NES. I just felt that from an editorial standpoint, that if a game had 10 songs, and 4 of them were jingles, and 2 of them were established theme songs, that it wouldn't be wise to discuss it. With this being an offshoot, I don't mind going back and bringing the phenomenal works of Koji Kondo back to your memory banks one more time. I'm certain it won't be the last. Mega Man was Capcom's lucky break. I say that because the first game was not successful, at least not in the grand scope of NES sales, and it was by pure luck that the old fuckers in suits decided to give this platformer another shake, resulting in Mega Man II, and cementing the franchise into the legendary halls of video game franchises. It's so hard to believe that from one close encounter with nixing the franchise, over 130 games would just not exist. Just take a moment to think about that. 130 games. As with all Mega Man games from the era, we have Mega Man going up against Dr. Wily, who betrays Dr. Light into believing he's reformed. They work together on this project named Gamma, a peacekeeping robot, but because Wily is an edgelord, he sabotages the robots to steal power crystals. And holy shit, we have a plot. Now this game is hard, it's not easy, but so many people consider this one of the greatest games on the NES, and for good reason. Capcom was delivering a solid platformer experience on a system inundated with horribly subpar ones. Mega Man 3 had a power team of the Fujitas, no relationship though, just pure happenstance, and here's some of their songs. It's worth it. Lots of talk about Metroid lately. I'm shocked someone in my Twitch community hasn't overridden my games to make me play the next one. For anyone who's curious, next Metroid for me is Metroid 2 Return of Samus on the Game Boy, and I do look forward to playing it at some point. Maybe then people will stop ripping me to shreds for not playing Super Metroid. It's just the whole idea of Metroid is fundamentally irritating to me. Going through mazes is not my jam. But hey, the franchise goes somewhere, so that's a good thing. Metroid is the first in the franchise, that's obvious. But what might not be so obvious is that the music in this game was composed by Hirokazu Tanaka, someone who had been around with Nintendo since they really started making games, and I feel in some ways he's always been overshadowed by Koji Kondo. But how do his songs sound? Let's check it out. You remember how I feel about Metroid? How I don't like mazes? I hold the same inclination towards Blaster Master. I'm also not a huge fan of Sunsoft to any capacity. I feel that their games are always chores that are magically saved by one person, Naoki Kodaka. To me, he's Japanese Tim Fallon, always made to compose for games that might be a kick to the shin from an overzealous 4-year-old. It stings, you want to say bad words, then you hear the music and you're like, oh, okay, that works. I can do this. Another thing that Sunsoft tends to do is dramatically change the context of their games. Do you remember Journey to Silius? It was in the last episode, which, if I haven't mentioned already, you should check out. I'll link it down below and at the end of this episode. But Journey to Silius involves Jay McCrae, the son of a scientist who creates Space Colony number 428. But originally, it was supposed to be based on the Terminator, but licensing issues arose. In the Famicom version, you can see some of the Terminator influence in Jay's character design. With that thought process in mind, you might recall Blaster Master involving a kid named Jason and his pet frog Fred, who jumps out of his enclosure, bebops out of the house, and swan dives into a hole, where Fred encounters a radioactive chest that turns him into a massive radioactive frog that journeys to the depths of Earth itself, where Jason then discovers a tank named Sophia III. But the original game was known as Chowakusei Senki Metafight, which takes place on the planet of Sophia III in the Epsilon Galaxy, where a bad dude named Goez invades, leading to Kane Gardner piloting the metal attacker, and the world we explore is essentially the battlefield. It's a pretty interesting localization if you ask me, but no matter what, the music is still badass. Oh boy, Raifafosu, or Life Force in English, is the English and European versions of Salamander. It's the continuation of Gradius, but also a spin-off at the same time, and that can be confusing. For those of you who don't know, the Gradius line of games is all over the place when it comes to naming conventions. The arcade has Gradius, also known as Nemesis. Gradius II is also known as Vulcan Venture. Gradius III and then Gradius IV were named normally. But on home computers, we had Nemesis 2, Nemesis 3, Gradius Gaiden, Gradius 5, and Gradius Rebirth. Then of course we have all of the spin-offs. It's a fairly deep franchise, and I'm glad that it kicked off for Konami. But Salamander has a weird release history. The original game is Salamander, then they did a re-release in Japan of the same game, known as Life Force. Now in Life Force, which is what I'll refer to it as moving forward, shows the story of the legendary spaceship Vic Viper minus most of what made Salamander pop in the arcade, which isn't a bad thing. The arcade version has tons of stuff that would have made the NES have a stroke if it tried to replicate. In fact, the sprite work we see in Life Force on the NES is a blend of elements from both the original Salamander and the re-release. It's a fun game, but it's a mean one. The music was composed by Konami legend Miki Higashino and 4 other composers, which is something that I tend to see from Konami a lot. They rely on teams, and I love teamwork. That teamwork crafted that signature rough Konami sound that we all know and love. Speaking of chronically confusing storylines, Konami kept that trend going on with Castlevania. The first 2 Castlevania games were related directly. Simon kills Dracula, then returns to bury his bones. But then in Castlevania III, we had an ancestor of Simon named Trevor, taking place in 1476, where Dracula first started, at least to date, being a douchebag. Castlevania III was interesting because it went back to the roots of what made the franchise so much fun, a linear action platformer, but man, this game kicked my butt. I don't like this game at all. But the ability to play a classic Castlevania game with characters we could meet, like Alucard, Sypha Belnades, or Grant Dynasty. Sounds like a porn star name, doesn't it? They're all great. Each of these characters offers some replayability in how we approach the game. Oh, by the way, if you want an even earlier game in the franchise, Lament of Innocence. It takes place in 1094. I don't even know how the fuck to say that year. True story. Again, in traditional Konami format, we have 4 composers, the leader of which was Hidenori Maezawa. Let's listen to the music. Batman. Now that's a franchise that had a rough start when it came to video games. In fact, the first 3 were kind of dog shit. Batman on the CPC was this isometric nightmare like Solstice or Equinox. The Caped Crusader on Amiga was this nonsensical time-pressured trial-and-error gimmick fest. And the 1989 Batman game on Amiga featured buff, top-heavy, never-works-on-legs Batman swinging around shooting grappling hooks out of his dick. So when Sunsoft was able to work on an NES adaptation, they knocked it out of the park. This is based on the 1989 film very loosely. Instead, I want to focus on Batman, who has Ryu Hayabusa's badass wall jump, the gadgets aren't counterintuitive, and unlike most Japanese developers at the time, it seemed like the team at Sunsoft at least cracked open a comic book or watched the movie and understood what they needed to do to make Bruce Wayne kick ass in the 8-bit era. Again, Kodaka returns with his signature melodical control, and I hope you recognize that as we listen to his songs. Known in the US as Ninja Gaiden, in Japan as Ninja Ryukenden, and Europe as Shadow Warriors, Ninja Gaiden is one of the hardest games you will encounter on the NES. One of the things I tend to say when I talk about this game is that it is essentially the litmus test of everything wrong with the NES. The knockback physics, infinite spawning enemies, magical pits of doom and despair, you name it, it's present on this game. The original Ninja Gaiden was an arcade game, but it was put on the NES, and in my opinion, it's better than the original game. In the arcade game, Ryu has a sword, but he damn near never uses it unless you pick up a sword that's on the ground, and his only attack seems to be a kick or throwing enemies. But in the NES game, he's capable of standing his ground, and it paved the way for a golden standard in action platforming games, especially ones that would involve both hacking and/or slashing at the same time. In the game, Ryu is on a revenge mission because his father died, and as the plot progresses, you'll find out why he died and just how deep into the system he was. And that plot continued over 2 more games on the NES. The music was composed by Keiji Yamagishi, a pioneer of chiptune music, and we'll hear that in this collection of music. And that's it for today's episode. What did you think of this list? I hope that these tunes brought you back to a moment when the CRT was the only light in the room, and it was just you in the game. Honestly, I'd kill to go back then. In some cases, I wish I could hear some of this music for the first time. By the way, if you made it to the end of this episode, you're already home in our community. We're a group of retro gaming enthusiasts who love remembering a time when life was just a little bit easier to live. And if you align with that, feel free to subscribe. We are so close to that milestone of 8,000 subscribers, and if we reach it, I'll do a special video of the community's choosing. Finally, the single most important thing you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the videos and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre out.